In anticipating having a conversation with you about some of this work, it it brought to mind one of my great mentors in my life, John Mohawk, the late John Mohawk, who was on the board of Bioneers for about 12 years and as a Iroquois Six Nations, a Seneca historian, a very serious historian actually, and also very involved with traditional culture. And he gave a talk in 1998 at the Bioneers conference that has always stuck with me, and I went back and looked at it. And what I'd like to do is to read you an excerpt of that that's a few minutes long, and I'd love to hear what your response is if it resonates with you.
Thank you. I look forward to that.
Okay, great. And he's talking about the origin of the other confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy, which is well over 1,000 years old. Um, so what he says is this: an individual born among the Hurons on the north side of Lake Ontario grew up in a society which was each against all. Blood feuds left not only villages fighting villages, but individual households fighting individual households. Violence ruled the day. People committed every kind of atrocity that they could against other people. It was a time, not unlike the 20th century, of absolute horror and degradation of the human soul. Coming out of this environment, one individual came up with an idea. He said violence is a really bad idea. He goes to the people he's living with and he says to the people, you have to stop these cycles of violence. In all Western thought, by the way, this particular strain of thinking is never canonized anywhere. So this individual, whom we'll call the Peacemaker, began to say that essentially war makes people crazy. When people are at war, they're not thinking clearly, and this is a problem. Then he goes on to try to define what it means to think clearly. He addresses two questions. How do we know when we're thinking clearly, and what does it mean to pursue peace? His argument is we have a power of our collective minds that we can create a world in which people do not use violence, but rather use thinking. He goes from village to village and persuades people that first we have to have a pact that says we're not going to do violence anymore. When you walk into a village and you say, we have to put down our weapons of war and have peace, they're going to say, not till the other guys do. To which these ones say, can't talk to them, they're all crazy. So he starts out by saying, when you tell yourself that your enemy can't think, you destroy your own power to make peace with him. You have to first acknowledge that the guy on the other side of the negotiation probably wants his people to live and probably wants a lot of the same things you do. So a piece of this starts with looking for common ground with the enemy. In the course of these conversations, what came up was that we're at war with these people because they've harmed us, and they listed out what the wrongs were. In the discussion, the Peacemaker says, the pursuit of peace is not merely the pursuit of the absence of violence, because peace is never achieved until justice is achieved, and justice is not achieved until everyone's interests are addressed. So, he says, you can't achieve peace unless it's accompanied by constant striving to address the issues of justice, which means that your job will never end because you will never actually finish addressing everyone's issues. Then he says we have to build an institution to represent this. He puts together the chiefs of the 5 nations. They come together and they form the Confederacy. But who are these chiefs of the Confederacy? What's their job? The chiefs of the Confederacy convene meetings, the purpose of which is to do clear thinking. They have a wonderful tradition that when someone has a proposition, they get up and articulate their proposition to the other side, and the other side has to tell them back what it was. And then they often have to do this in their own languages, in more than one language. The Peacemaker said that the problem that all humanity faces is that the absence of peace will lead to the end of human life on this planet. He says also that it's injustice that's the big disturber of peace. So long as there is injustice, the people of the planet face the possibility of extinction. He didn't say that we'd kill each other off with war clubs. He said that in the end, unless we achieve peace among ourselves, the people of the planet will be eliminated. We're living, John concluded, in a period of warfare between the rich and the poor. How people are treating one another in the world has no relationship at all to thinking about how we sustain human life on the planet. If our thinking changes from the question of how to enrich the rich to the question about how to see the sustainability of our species, see to the sustainability of our species on the planet, as we make that change, we would be engaging ourselves in an enormous revolution, which is what is in the best interests of future generations, of the people of the world, and of the other species of the world. So that's some of John Mohawk's words that, for me, really spoke to the kind of work you do. And I would love if you could respond to any of that.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing it. I think it's very much needed now. It's quite beautiful. The parts of it that reminds me when he talked about all the tribes and even families fighting against each other, it reminded me of Hobbes' State of Nature. When Hobbes said, "State of nature is a constant war of all against all," and people taking him literally, but he said that's why we come into society to sort of stop this war all against all. So I think that violence and war, first of all, I would distinguish the two, because it seems to me, I think of us as spiritual animals. And sometimes we lean more into our spiritual part, and sometimes we lean more into our animal part. And to me, one of the expressions of spirituality is an awareness and a lived practice where we are profoundly interconnected with everything else. And our animal nature is driven by needs for food and maybe sex, and can be violent in those pursuits. But animals, for the most part, don't make war. They have an immediate need, and once that immediate need is addressed, they stop. Humans, because the special animals that we are, we actually organize wars. And by some accounts, wars are relatively recent. It's not thousands and thousands of years old, maybe 10,000 years old, but it's not 100,000 years old. So war is this organized process. And in that organized process, it's also an organized recognition of the other, not on an individual level. Not that I don't like you or you don't like me. It's like, I don't like those people. I don't like that tribe. And so it's much more pernicious. And we've had these great organizations, but and still we haven't dealt with the issue of who the we and who the us is, us and them. So I like what you shared. I would make one, probably maybe two shifts. I don't think thinking can get us there. I believe in cognitive process thinking, but it's radically incomplete. We have to bring the heart and soul into this as well. And the work that we're doing now with the mind science, and we know by some accounts, most of our mental processes are behind us and behind our backs. We don't see them. They affect us. They affect how we feel. And then we make up stories at the cognitive level, at the thinking level. And so I would not disparage thinking, but neither would I put it in the driver's seat. It's just one among many tools. And so we have to think about how do we actually bring in alignment with the heart, the soul, both for ourselves and with each other. So with that sort of adjustment, I think what you shared is as important today as it was in 1998 or 1,000 years ago.
Right. So you told me, I think it was a couple of years ago, you went to Texas. You were invited to Texas to meet with 13 newly elected Black judges. I believe they were all women, if I recall correctly. And what you told me at that time was that one of the things you shared with them was that the law is 30 years behind the neuroscience, the brain neuroscience of how we other people. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yes, and it's interesting because some people, when you introduce an idea to them, before they embrace the idea, they want to know what impact is that going to have on the world as I see it today. So it's not, is this right or is this wrong? It's like, is this going to be consequential? I think, for example, a lot of people's apparent and maybe real opposition to climate change is that, so are you saying I have to stop driving my gasoline car? Are you saying I have to stop mining oil? Are you saying I'm gonna lose my job? Maybe, maybe not. But whether you have to, whether you're gonna lose your job or not, doesn't determine whether or not climate change is real. But a lot of people, again, start with what's the impact of this if it's real? And if the impact is negative, then I don't want to do it. And not only do I not want to do it, I'm going to deny its validity. And so I think a lot of law and a lot of judges and a lot of legal makers, they start off with the idea that if the unconscious is real, not in a Freudian sense, because the neuroscience is basically about 35 years old, and it's not analytic in the way that Freud was. It's actually measured. It's empirical. We actually can now sort of see the brain operating. We can see the firing of neurons. We can see electric pathways in the brain, and then we can study them and find out what their association is. We understand the amygdala in a way that we didn't, that Freud didn't. And we can actually see people make decisions before the conscious mind is aware of it. We can watch the process of thinking at unconscious level before it becomes conscious. We have a door into the basement of our mind. And we actually can manipulate that. That's part of what the big fight is in terms of social media, that they figured this out. If I show you a certain picture, if I show you a certain word, if I show you a certain sequence, it's going to affect who you are. We reject that, not just at the legal perspective, but as a society, because we like to believe we're masters of our own fate. We like to believe we know what we want and we know what we think. We know who we are. Turns out all of that's overstated. So the law, which largely grew up sort of reflecting on the Enlightenment period, which was based on the idea that the conscious mind is in control. That's Descartes. I think, therefore I am. And so the law is obsessed with the rational conscious mind and doesn't trust feelings, doesn't trust emotions, doesn't trust. And so Freud threatened that. And then the mind science is like blowing it out of the water. And so rather than people sort of engaging, you can engage it and critique it and learn from it. It's like, but if I say this, then you're telling me I don't really know what I think. Then you're going to tell me that, you know, if you go to a store, people used to say this, if you go to a store and someone gives you incorrect change, it might be a mistake. But when they always give you too little, they never give you too much. At some point you said, there's a pattern here. It's not random. It's not that the person can't count, because they always count in their favor. The mistake is always in their favor. And that's how much of our society is. You know, frankly, the mistakes that we make in society are too often in favor of one group as opposed to another group. And they call that implicit bias. It's not conscious necessarily, but there's a pattern to it. And when you look at that pattern, and I'll give you one concrete example, there was a famous case called McCluskey. And there was something in the McCluskey case called the Baldus study. And Professor Baldus, Dr. Baldus, did this study of looking at over 230 different explanations as to why Black people got the death penalty more often than white people in Georgia. And they said, well, you know, people always give you another thing. Well, maybe it's class, maybe it's education, maybe it's the nature of the crime, maybe it's. He said, okay, I'm gonna look at all these things, and I'm gonna do a fancy econometrics regression to see if any of these things explain that. And when he finished, he said, no, that the only thing that left standing was race. And that's a violation of our stated principles in the Constitution. Race is not supposed to decide whether you live or die at the hands of the state. And what the U.S. Supreme Court said is that we cannot find anything wrong with this study. This is an extremely sophisticated study, but we don't like where it's going. If we accepted this study in terms of the death penalty, we'd have to change a bunch of things in the law. We'd have to change the way we think about housing. We'd have to change the way we think about jury selection. We'd have to change the way we think about who gets credit in banks. We have to change. And one of the dissenting justices, Justice Stevens, I believe, He said, you're concerned that there'd be too much justice. And so they rejected it. They rejected the study because the implications was that there are all these patterns in our society that are deeply racialized, even at that unconscious level. The good news is Justice Kennedy, in one of his last opinions in a case called Inclusive Community Program, he actually cited a brief that we worked on out of the Institute and acknowledged that implicit bias was real and that the court should take it into account. But most of the justices, and certainly most of the conservative justices, won't acknowledge that. And it's not because they've studied the literature and found flaws in it. They don't like the implications of it. And so it's still hard to use it in the court of law. We'll get there eventually, but we may be 50 or 100 years late.
Mm-hmm. And you've said also that some of what the science shows in the neuroscience is that when we see someone that we consider as the other, there's actually a really different response in our brain that occurs.
There's a part of the brain that lights up when we see another human being, and we're not sure all of when the brain lights up, it's doing something, right? So we're not sure what all it's doing. We're not showing what emotions are being released or what chemicals are being released, but something's going on. Nature thought it would be kind of cool that when you see another fellow species, you say, hey, there's another fellow species. I'm not going to invite him or her home. I'm not going to buy him coffee, but it's just, hey, human, one human to another, which is the beginning of the science of mind, the idea that we can empathize with someone. We can say, you know what, I sort of see Kenny recognize that there's something there, and we can build on that. When we see someone who's deeply othered, and we can actually measure someone being othered or not, and Susan Fisk at Princeton has done really great work in this area. So there's certain groups in any society that are othered in a durable, institutional, structural way. So it's not just sliding someone on the street. When that happens, then that part of the brain does not light up. When you see that person, so at an unconscious level, you see someone and the brain is not recognizing them as human. And I've written a piece about this, basically saying you can't effectively adopt policy for a human being that you don't see as human at an unconscious level. And it tracks just what you would think. So homeless people in the United States as collectively are not seen as human. Black men returning from prison collectively are not seen as human. Although I wonder if the work around movement for Black Lives, Black Lives Matter, has begun to change that. Now, if you ask anyone, is that homeless person human? Of course, they're going to say yes. So this is not what's in the conscious mind. This is what's in the unconscious mind. And it turns out what's in the unconscious mind in terms of our behavior, in terms of our practice, is actually oftentimes more important than what's in our conscious mind. Our unconscious is really doing most of the work.
Exactly. You know, this cycles back to what you said in your talk with the greeting that says, I see you, and that it's about recognition. And so I think this aspect of the brain science is incredibly important in that light too. It does come back to I see you, I recognize you as another human being.
And that's really what Black Lives Matter is saying. It's like, recognize me as a human being. Recognize that I'm not the other, that I actually matter, and I should matter to you. I should matter to, and what people are asking for, people are demanding, is that I get the same thing that other people get. And that's what sometimes I say it's really Black Lives Matter too. People say, well, all lives matter. Guess what? But you don't hear white people complaining that they were killed by the police, by the state, because they were white. Sometimes you hear gay people say that. I was killed or tortured by the state because I'm gay. Sometimes you hear women say that. I didn't get the job because I'm a woman. But no one that I've heard of says, I'm afraid and killed by the police. That's a hate crime. A crime is saying, you are not really human. You don't count. And so it's really what Charles Taylor from Canada would say, is the politic of recognition. I want you to recognize me as a human being. It's just that simple. And I'm prepared, and I do recognize you as a human being. And that's the beginning of bridging. That's the beginning of bridging that leads to belonging.
Beautiful. Yeah, exactly. Um, one thing that's been really striking to me 5 years ago, terms like implicit bias and systemic racism were largely found in academic communities and among, certain parts of activist communities. And just in this past year, in 2020, it's gone mainstream. I wonder how that happened, how you see that, and what it means.
It's actually great. Although I have a worry, I was part of the group in the 1990s that pushed the idea of structural racism because uh, words have this sort of formal meaning, but they also have their cultural meaning. And racism in the United States has grew up with the notion that it's individual intentionally having animus toward another individual because of their race. And so Stokely Carmichael and Hamilton wrote a book in the 1960s about institutional racism, but it didn't stick. So people still think of racism as I'm not a racist because I don't have conscious animus toward another person. Well, implicit bias teaches us, and the mind science teaches us that you can have racialized practices without conscious animus. And again, this is one of the things the law is struggling with. How is that possible? Uh, and interestingly enough, black people can have racial animus against black people. Women can have gender animus against women. That's really messes with people's heads. Like, how is that possible? So if you think about what happened in Baltimore, uh, and the black person was killed in Baltimore by the police, and the New York Times ran a piece saying it could not have been about race because one of the police officers were black. It's like, no, that doesn't mean it's not about race. That's not the way the mind, the unconscious works. So it is good that it's getting out there, but there are a lot of nuances that we miss. And one nuance that we miss is that uh, even when people embrace the idea of implicit bias, they say what that means. And I did a thing on NPR a couple of years ago, and they said, so this means that since almost all people, especially white people in our society, have implicit bias, that they're all implicitly racist. That's not what it means. Uh, because those biases are not something that happens between the head. Those biases is the unconscious reflecting what's happening in large society. It learns from what it sees in large society, and that's how it gets. And because it's happening in the large society, it actually ends up affecting not just white people. So anti-black racism also affects black people. Uh, being part of a patriarchal society doesn't just affect men; it affects women. And people get confused, like how can women, after all the thing that Trump said, still vote for him? The majority of white women, like 56, 57%, voted for Trump. Um, and one of the ways you make sense of that, if you're in a society where this is in the water, everybody's in the water. Not the people not affected the same, but everybody's affected. And one of my favorite sayings is that who discovered water? And the answer is I'm not sure, but I'm certain it was not a fish. And in our society, because there's so much racialization from the very beginning, from not just in terms of organizing our society, but in organizing our identities. Uh, that the people who have been at the center of this, i.e., people who are phenotypically white, they have a harder time seeing the water. And when people call it out, it's like, what are you talking about? I'm not racist. I don't, I have black friends. So, the police with his knee on the neck of George Floyd, he was married to a woman of color. So that proves he's not racist? No. It's much more nuanced than that. And so, yes, I'm glad it's getting out there, but I worry a little bit that we have not actually dealt with the nuance. And that when we talk about these things, we're talking about structures and cultures. And because we're an individualistic society, we reduce them to the individual. It's the individual that's bad. And we spend all of our time trying to fix the individual without fixing the water.
Exactly. No, the fish do not see the water they swim in, or as far as we know, anyway. So that's a good segue because one thing that you talk about, I've heard you speak about Hurricane Katrina and the massive public response that was overwhelmingly in support of supporting people financially, having the government intervene, and the government did not intervene under George W. Bush, and people were pretty much left out in the cold. And you've said that the human heart, the human spirit are crucial and necessary, but we also have to have our institutions, and this behavior and these values have to be codified and acted upon in that way. And a question I have for you is that this othering is not just sort of an issue of the human psyche or culture in that way. It's not operating in isolation. And when you look, for example, at the nature of capitalism, it was founded in colonialism, in the genocide and erasure of First Peoples, in obviously slavery, and in the exploitation of successive waves of immigrants who were branded as other at whatever moment in time that might have occurred. So Robert Hare, the psychologist who created the psychopathy index, he originally did that working with people incarcerated in prisons, studying very violent, criminals who would be considered psychopathic. He said if he weren't studying these people in prisons, he'd be studying Wall Street. And that's, in fact, the psychopathy checklist becomes almost a menu for how you hire the right people. It's basically, these are the qualities you want. And so my question for you is, and obviously there's enormous financial benefit for elites in othering people. I mean, women are paid less. We came out of slavery. That's pretty straightforward. So can you decouple othering structurally from capitalism in that regard?
That's a great question, Kenny, and it goes back a little bit to what I was saying about people who are involved in social movements. They sometimes load up the precondition for bridging in such a way that we can't bridge. Like first we have to get rid of capitalism. First we have to, and it's not that I'd say three things. Capitalism is not one thing. It's we had capitalism before 1970 or 1980, and then we had a different form of capitalism. We did what we call liberalize the market, which is operated very differently than the capitalism of the 1950s. Trump actually, I think, has introduced in the United States a whole different notion of capitalism. By all counts, we could say Canada is a capitalist country, and it's not controversial that they have national health care. And so there's a range of capitalist country. For example, in Japan, the return that was expected on capital was like very small compared to the returns on the capital that we expected. And even Max Weber wrote a book called Protestant and the Spirit of Capitalism. And what he argued in that book is that capitalism is interacting with other systems. And what he argued in that book is that capitalism in Catholic countries was much more humane than capitalism in Protestant countries. Now, why would that be? And what he argued, first of all, it's empirical. He goes through and looks at country and tries to show that you look at inequality, you look at conditions, you look at willingness to actually care for workers, and almost without fail, Protestant countries were worse than capitalist countries. And so why is that? Well, two things that comes to mind. One, the way we think about individuality under Protestant countries. Individuality is much more deeply grounded in Protestantism than in Catholicism. Two, the kind of individualism, basically, especially coming out of Calvinism, is like you have no obligation to your fellow brother and sister, which under most Catholic expression, you do have some obligation. You may not exercise it. It may be distorted, but you have some obligation. You certainly have obligation under Islam. That's what Ramadan is about. So if you start off with in England, when they built soup kitchens and poorhouses, they built them 15 and 20 miles out of town because it's like, okay, I'm gonna give you something. You're poor and destitute, but you got to work for this. I mean, I'm afraid to so the kind of capitalism became the Anglo-American capitalism has historically been the harshest, the harshest. Um, and then, of course, there are other people who said that capitalism in the United States was not just Protestant capitalism, it was racialized capitalism. And so race has played a pernicious role. And people have looked at this and say that the capitalism that came out of the United States is informed by a deep sense of white dominance and white superiority in a way that's not as deep in other countries. That's shifting. So what I'm suggesting is that how far can we get in terms of addressing othering and belonging under capitalist system? We probably can't get all the way there, but we can go a lot further than what we have right now. We don't have to have homelessness. We can still have capitalism. We can have insurance for everyone. We can still have capitalism. We can have schools that work. We can still have capitalism. And I'm not defending capitalism, but I'm saying the United States form of capitalism that was transformed into neoliberalism and that's now got transformed again under Trumpism. We just have a book out about this. It's a very different system. And so I think it's really important to not lump all of them just as capitalism. They're really, so capitalism covers a ton of sins, and some of them are worse than others.
No, that's a really great point. And, just look at various countries in Europe where you have something much closer to a social democracy, a form of capitalism where there is a sense of the common good and of the public, of the commons at large. And these can coexist.
Right, that's right. I mean, in Germany, again, not perfect by any means, but Germany believes, and not just believes, it practice power sharing in corporations. So corporations have to have members of the union and sometimes members of the community on the corporate boards.
Yeah, workers' councils.
In the United States, that would be illegal. We've structured in so that corporations can't share or limit in how much they can share with community. Henry Ford when he was head of the Ford Motor Company, he tried to give his workers a raise. He did give his workers a raise. The shareholders sued him because they said the reason for corporations to exist in the United States was to extract as much profit as possible, which means you pay your workers as little as possible. But that was a pernicious kind of capitalism. And so, again, I think power sharing is real. If we're going to have a society where people belong, that's why when I talk about belonging, one of those four tenets is power. We have to think about not noblesse oblige, not foundations, how much money they're giving. That's all good, well and good. But we have to share power. It's not power over, it's power with. How do we share power throughout? And that's also what a radical sense of democracy is about. The people make their own rules, and everyone benefits from those rules.
Right, right. Well, my last question for you is in this time of extreme polarization, where also that polarization is being very deliberately created, to politically subdivide and conquer for whatever political ends. If you could wave a magic wand to redirect the energy and where things are moving in that way, both in the culture and the institutions, what would be some of the first things or the most important things that you would wave your magic wand over?
Well, a couple of things I would do. I would say to all the Bioneers, become ambassadors, become bridgers, and steep yourself in that. I mean, we spent most of our lives and most of our existence as a country learning to break, learning to other people. I mean, the language out of some of the cases out of the Supreme Court, it's just, I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. Where they say blacks can never be part of the political community. They're not considered human. This is not, the Ku Klux Klan. This is Supreme Court justices saying stuff like that. And even though we don't say it anymore, all of our institutions and practices was informed with that. So we carry it with us. So how do we turn that around? Now, the interesting thing is you made mention of how people were using the term structural institutional racism and implicit bias. And particularly, being more poignant, you mean white people. The majority of white people in America thinks now, probably for the first time, that racism is a problem. How do you actually build on that? And how do you build on in a way that doesn't actually isolate white people, right? I don't believe in, okay, white people, go back to your own community and after you fix your community, you can come back. It's like, no, that's still a kind of second class citizenship. Uh, how do you engage everyone while you center in this country anti-Black racism, addressing anti-Black racism? We need different stories. We need bigger stories. We need stories where we all can shine, where we all can participate, where we all can love. Um, but we need more than stories. We need practices. So how do we actually reflect that in the way we organize our physical space, the way we do taxes, the way we do voting? I mean, it's obscene how far the Republican Party was willing to go to disenfranchise low-income Black and Latino voters. In Texas, I'm sure you saw that they're saying Harris County, which is 4 million people, could have one drop-off box in the whole county. One woman said she had to drive over an hour to get to that drop-box box. This is democracy. We won't even talk about the Electoral College. So I think we need to have practical stories. We need to have understand an intention, a future where we all belong. We have to understand that Bigger Thomas and his family can never be on the same bridge completely while the structure is in place. So we have to work internally, what we call internally, mindful, but we also have to work on those structures. And because this is a lifelong work, we have to do it while we're having fun, while we're having joy, while we're loving, and we have to be vulnerable. So my magic wand would be new stories, new practices, and new intentions. And with a lot of bridges um, and a lot of empathetic and compassionate stories.
Hmm. Yes, sometimes I talk about intention deficit disorder. It goes a long way, intention. So, John, what a joy and an honor and pleasure. And I always learn so much talking with you and listening to you. So, on behalf of Bioneers and the community, thank you, thank you, thank you. And great good luck with all this brilliant, powerful work.
But thank you, Kenny. And uh, I often say to people, words are just words. I consider myself a academic, um, but it hardens me to both have friendships, but also the work that Bioneers is doing has already done and will continue to do. It seems to me to be building on this. That you're out in the world with thousands, hundreds of thousands of people trying to help them build these bridges. And so, thank you. I appreciate what you've been doing and what you will do.
Thank you very much.